The fluorescent lights emitted a faint buzzing in the deserted corridor, casting a cold, bluish sheen across the pristine white tiles. It was nearly 3 a.m, and the hospital looked like a forgotten planet, silent, distant, and cut off from the outside world. Claire Bennett's feet ached unbearably. After 16 continuous hours on duty, her nurse's uniform clung to her like a second skin, soaked with sweat and the familiar scent of antiseptic. She had checked every patient on the ward, updated charts, replenished medical supplies. Only one room remained, room 512. The comatose patient, but not an ordinary one. Vincent Morelli. Just hearing his name was enough to make the trainee nurses whisper among themselves, while the veteran nurses discreetly checked the emergency alarm before ending their shifts. The crime lord, the killer, the devil in a tailored suit. The man carried more rumors than a disgraced politician. Some said he ruled the entire East Coast underworld. Others whispered that he once walked out of a burning building with blood staining his shirt and a crooked smile, as if he had just enjoyed a beautiful piece of music. Yet now, lying motionless here, silent and unresponsive, he looked more like a statue than a threat. A sharp jawline, high cheekbones, black hair slightly curled at the ends, spilling across the white pillow. Dozens of medical machines beside him blinked steadily, tracking every breath, every heartbeat. For more than 2 weeks, he had not moved, not opened his eyes, not spoken a single word, only breathed. Claire stood beside the bed with her arms folded across her chest, letting exhaustion weigh heavily on her shoulders. "Another quiet night, Mr. Morelli," she whispered, her voice softer than the steady hiss of the ventilator beside him. She did not know why she kept talking to him. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps loneliness, or perhaps, just perhaps, because he could not interrupt her, could not argue, could not hurt her. "I know I shouldn't talk to you," she continued as her hand gently smoothed the edge of the blanket, "but sometimes pretending that someone is listening feels easier than facing the silence, even if it is only a ghost lost in a dream." Her voice fractured softly, just enough to reveal the truth she had never dared to admit, that she was so tired of being strong, tired of being forgotten, tired of being invisible in a place that only remembered chaos. She lowered her gaze and looked at him closely, and something in her chest tightened. He should not be this beautiful, not him, not the man whose hands were stained with so much blood. Yet in this moment, silent and breathing weakly, he looked more human than any man she had encountered in years. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it, gently brushing the stray strand of hair from his forehead. "You shouldn't make me feel like this," she whispered, and then, without thinking, because if she thought she would not have done it, Claire leaned down and pressed her lips to his, not out of romance, not out of desire, but as a release, a prayer, a sigh in the darkness, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer. She pulled back quickly, her heart pounding violently in her chest. "I wish you could hear me," she breathed. "I wish someone could hear me." And then he inhaled, deep and sudden. The blood in her veins seemed to freeze. His jaw twitched. The fingers beneath the blanket began to move. He was waking up. Claire stumbled backward and struck the instrument table, a syringe clattering across the floor. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "No, that's impossible." Then his eyes opened, dark, cold, like a beast rising from sleep. That gaze locked onto her, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse and low as if dragged back from death itself. "You kissed me, nurse. Now you will have to live with the consequences. If you are still listening at this moment, do not turn away just yet. Please take a very small moment to subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this story so that others may also feel the tense heartbeat that Claire and Vincent are living through second by second. And if your heart tightened even slightly during the scene you just heard, leave us a comment to let us know where you are listening from which city, from what quiet corner of the night, so that we may know how far this story has traveled and perhaps, somewhere along the way, your story is quietly meeting ours within the same shared breath. Claire stood frozen in place, both hands gripping the edge of the hospital bed as if the moment she let go, her body would collapse onto the cold tiled floor. Her eyes were wide, her heart pounding violently inside her chest, each beat threatening to shatter her ribcage and burst free. Vincent Morelli continued to stare at her, his gaze deep and impenetrable, black as a bottomless abyss, where all escape became meaningless. There was no alarm sounding, no other nurse rushing in, no footsteps at all beyond the slow, steady beeping of the heart monitor counting down like a silent clock. Claire forced herself to take a deep breath, but her chest felt bound by an invisible cord. She did not know how to answer or even whether she should. You're awake," she stammered, and instantly wished she could strike the foolish words from her mouth, because of course he was awake and of course he had heard everything. She felt sweat soak down her spine as though she had just struck a single match in the middle of a gasoline warehouse, and now could only stand there waiting for the explosion. Vincent's eyes never left her. Unblinking, one corner of his mouth curved upward slowly and coldly like a predator sensing its trembling prey. There was no weakness in those eyes, no trace of confusion or injury. Instead, they were sharp as blades and terrifyingly alert. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and rough yet unwavering. Claire swallowed hard and forced her voice not to tremble. Claire Bennett." He closed his eyes for one brief second as if committing the name to memory, then opened them again, and this time the weight of his stare made her step back half a pace. "You spoke many things while I was unconscious." Her heart lurched. She had never heard a simple sentence feel so much like a hand closing around her throat. I didn't think you would hear me, but I did," he cut in without looking away. "Every word, every night, your complaints, your loneliness, even the dreams you have never told anyone." Heat rushed to Claire's face. She wanted to deny it, to refute it, but the truth stood naked before her. He had heard it all. She turned her face away for a second to regain her composure, but when she looked back, Vincent had lifted his hand in a small, slow yet commanding motion, and instantly 2 men in black suits appeared at the doorway, as if they had been waiting all along. Claire had never seen them in the hospital, and the lifeless coldness in their eyes sent a chill through her. Vincent made the faintest gesture, and they nodded and disappeared. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood one thing clearly. The man before her was no ordinary patient who had just awakened from a coma. He was a kingpin, and even from a hospital bed, he still moved everything like pieces on a chessboard. "Why am I still alive?" The question escaped Claire's lips before she could stop herself. Vincent tilted his head slightly, as though reading her very thoughts. "Do you think the hallway was empty by accident? I ordered my men to pull back completely. I wanted to see who would dare come close, who would seize the chance to strike, and who would choose to stay." Claire felt as though she had been stripped bare. She was no longer merely a nurse, no longer a nameless caretaker in this hospital. In his eyes, she was the one who had given him life, or at least the one who had pulled him back from the edge of death, if only by a single kiss. "I will be transferred to the private suite immediately, and you, Claire Bennett, will be the only one permitted to enter." His voice was a command that allowed no refusal. Claire stood motionless. She had kissed a man she believed would never awaken, and now he looked at her as though he had chosen her long before, as though she had stepped into a game whose rules she would never fully understand. And it was already too late to turn back. Vincent Morelli was awake, and from that first gaze, Claire knew with certainty that nothing in her life would ever be normal again. The following morning, the hospital, which was always noisy, became eerily abnormal. Claire sensed it the moment she stepped out of the elevator. There were no hurried footsteps of nurses, no emergency bells ringing from patient rooms. The air itself felt thick and heavy like a storm silently gathering. She walked toward the nurses' station, which was usually the liveliest center of the day shift. Yet today only a few faces remained. All heads lowered. No one speaking, no one daring to smile. Their eyes met only briefly before turning away. A cold shiver crawled along Claire's spine, and just as she was about to ask what was happening, a low voice spoke directly behind her. "Miss Bennett." She turned to find a tall, unfamiliar man in a black suit, with a square jaw and eyes as cold as ice. He wore no name badge, and bore nothing to suggest he was a member of hospital staff. "My name is Marco. From now on you will be exclusively assigned to Mr. Pod. Morelli's care." Claire frowned, and instinctively stepped back half a pace. I don't believe I have the authority to make that decision." Marco looked at her as though she were an insect that had just dared to make a sound. "I do not think you fully understand the situation. This is not a request." Her heart began to race. She glanced over Marco's shoulder, and only then noticed 2 other men standing by the elevator doors, also in black suits with small wireless devices in their ears. She swallowed and realized that the strange silence in the hospital that morning was not coincidence but arrangement. "This hospital has security and a director," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Marco smiled, but his smile never reached his eyes. "The director is having breakfast in his office with one of our men, and if you look toward the main entrance, you will see that no one has been allowed in or out this morning. Security has already changed shifts." Claire felt her blood pressure drop in an instant as she moved to the glass doors, overlooking the lobby below. And exactly as Marco said, instead of doctors and staff coming and going, there were 3 unfamiliar men standing guard before the main Entrance, none in uniform, none recognizable, all broad-shouldered and stone-still. She turned back, her mouth dry. "Why me?" Marco studied her for a moment longer before answering. "Mr. Morelli named you personally and no one else. You were the last person to speak with him before he woke. You are the only one he wished to see when he opened his eyes." Claire felt her legs weaken as images from the previous night flooded her mind. The kiss, Vincent's gaze, his quiet voice heavy as iron. She had entered his world, and now there was no turning back. "I still have other patients," she said weakly as a final excuse. Marco stepped closer and lowered his voice. "From this moment forward, Mr. Morelli is your only patient. If you serve him well, everything will proceed smoothly. If not, people will begin to ask questions about you, about your family, about things you never want to see printed in a newspaper." Claire stood rigid, lips pressed tight, her heart pounding like a war drum. She understood a threat when it was spoken as softly as a feather. Marco did not need to raise his voice or lift his hand. He only needed to mention what had not yet happened but could happen at any time. She nodded faintly, her thoughts spinning. "Good," Marco said as he stepped back. "The new room is prepared. You have 10 minutes to gather your things. After that, we will escort you." When Marco turned and walked away, Claire remained where she stood as if turned to stone. This hospital, the place she once believed to be safe and governed by justice, had now been quietly seized without weapons and without gunfire by the power of a single name, Vincent Morelli, and from this moment forward she was his whether she wished it or not. The glossy black SUV glided smoothly along the asphalt as if every movement had been programmed in advance. Claire sat in the back seat with her hand clenched tightly around the strap of her handbag, her eyes fixed on the window, yet truly seeing nothing at all. The city drifted past her in blurred washes of color, and with every passing minute she was carried farther away from the life she had once known. Marco sat in the front in silence, and the driver never glanced at her even once. No one bound her. There were no handcuffs and no direct threats, yet never in her life had Claire felt so completely controlled. After nearly an hour of driving away from the city center, the vehicle turned onto a winding road shaded by trees and led toward a massive iron gate that opened automatically as they approached to reveal a world entirely different from the city-sided one she had left behind. The Morelli estate rose before her like something torn from the pages of a classic novel about the Italian elite. A 3-story mansion of white stone with a dark tiled roof and tall arched windows veiled by sheer curtains. The grounds were immaculately trimmed, and a fountain at the center of the courtyard murmured without pause. Luxurious, magnificent, and cold. The car stopped before the marble-paved entrance hall, and another man stepped forward to open the door for her. Claire drew a deep breath and stepped out, catching only fleeting glimpses of discreetly mounted cameras and shadowed figures appearing and vanishing in distant corridors. She was not free even though there were no bars. Marco led her inside, each of her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the stone floor in the vast space. The interior was even more opulent than the exterior, with crystal chandeliers suspended from the high ceiling. Antique paintings lining the corridors and carpets so thick that footsteps vanished into silence. Yet the air felt heavy as though the walls themselves were saturated with lies and bargains struck in the dark. They brought her to a room on the second floor, whose open door revealed a space like a luxury hotel suite, with a large bed dressed in flawless white linens, a vanity, a bookcase, and a wide window overlooking the garden beyond. Even the private bathroom was fully prepared with hot water and fresh towels waiting. Claire set down her bag and stood still because this room was meant to be the dream of every girl who had ever watched films about the rich. Yet to her it felt like a gilded cage. She tested the door and found it unlocked, but 2 men stood guard outside, and one of them glanced at her and nodded as if he had known all along that she would try. She closed the door again with sweat soaking her palms. No chains held her yet. She knew that if she left this place without permission, there would be no safe ground left for her to return to. An hour later there was a knock at the door, and an older woman in a servant's uniform entered with a tray of food and a neatly folded set of new clothes. The woman said little and only gestured that lunch had been prepared, and Mr. Morelli would see her after she changed. Claire looked down at the black velvet dress laid carefully on the bed, then at the nurse's uniform she had been wearing since the night before, as if she herself had been stripped from her former world within the span of 24 hours. She changed in silence, and the reflection staring back at her from the mirror was filled with doubt and confusion. The woman returned on time, and led her through the corridors along the white stone walls to a large room at the far end of the hall. The door opened and Claire stepped into the world of Vincent Morelli. He was seated with his back resting against a leather armchair, his gaze directed toward the window, yet clearly aware of her arrival. Light filtered through the curtains and cast shadows across his face in a way that made his dark eyes seem even deeper and more dangerous. He did not smile and did not speak, only gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him. And the moment she did, he turned and looked straight at her, a gaze that caused her heart to stumble, not from fear but from the unsettling sensation that she was being stripped bare. Every thought, every memory, every emotion read like an open book. She had entered the domain of Vincent Morelli, and she understood that from this moment forward none of the choices would truly belong to her anymore. Vincent's recovery was almost impossibly swift, and only a few days after waking he was already standing on his own and walking slowly around the room, as though asserting mastery over every space he occupied. Claire monitored each step with a mix of vigilance and curiosity as she checked his vital signs and adjusted his medication. Yet what unsettled her most were not the medical readings but the way Vincent looked at her each time their eyes met. There was no suspicion and no friendliness either. Only one thing was unmistakable in that gaze: absolute attention. He did not speak much, but when he did, every word was carefully chosen and carried a weight she could not avoid. On the morning of the third day, as Claire was changing the old bandage on his left shoulder, Vincent suddenly asked if she was always so quiet. She flinched slightly but replied in a professional tone that she believed patients needed rest more than conversation. He tilted his head without taking his eyes off her and said that he found she carried more inside her than he did. Claire paused for a heartbeat, then continued her work without answering, but his words followed her for the rest of the afternoon. Vincent began to tell small stories, neither full confessions nor idle chatter, about a winter night in Chicago, when he was ambushed and had to run 7 blocks to survive, about a time he drank with an old enemy, and woke the next morning in a truck headed toward the Mexican border. His stories always ended halfway, as though he were setting bait to see whether she would bite. Claire did not respond, yet she listened at first out of curiosity and later, because she could no longer stop herself from wanting to know more. There was something in the way Vincent told these stories that made one forget who he was, and forget the blood and gunfire of his past. When he smiled faintly with only one corner of his mouth curving upward, Claire realized it was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. Not a mocking one, nor a calculated mask, but a rare flicker of warmth that softened the air. Around them, one rainy afternoon they sat together in the mansion's library, Vincent reading a hardbound book printed in Old Italian, while Claire recorded test results on her tablet when he suddenly asked if she had ever been in love. She looked up, unsure whether it was the question itself or the strange sincerity in his voice that caught her off guard, and answered that she once thought she had, but later realized it had only been a need to feel cared for rather than love. Vincent fell silent with a contemplative gaze, then closed the book and placed it on the table, and said that love was a cruel gamble, in which one either lost everything or never truly had anything at all. Claire felt her throat go dry because his words always carried the aftertaste of someone who had lived far beyond his years, and lost more than an ordinary person could endure. And gradually she realized that she had begun to wait for the moments of being with him, not because of duty and not because she was forced, but because when she was beside Vincent, the outside world seemed cut off. Within this cold mansion and these silent walls, he was the only flame that warmed her, even if only for a fleeting instant. Claire tried to convince herself that everything she felt was merely a natural response between patient and caregiver, a hidden form of Stockholm Syndrome disguised by danger and a voice with lethal allure. Yet deep in her heart she knew better than anyone that she was stepping into forbidden territory. Each time Vincent looked at her with eyes that were half probing and half understanding, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, where one more step would mean she could never turn back. But what frightened her most was not the fall itself, it was that she was no longer certain she even wanted to turn back. Rain had been falling since late afternoon, each heavy drop striking the library window like the steady tapping of a metronome against memories long locked away. Claire sat opposite Vincent under the pale yellow glow of an old reading lamp. Surrounded by hundreds of brown leather-bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of damp paper and the faint trace of whiskey rising from the glass in his hand. Vincent remained silent for a long time, his gaze not upon her but fixed on some invisible point in the distance, as if an unseen door there led straight back into his past. Claire did not speak because she had learned that sometimes silence itself was the key that unlocked what words could never reach. "My father died when I was 12. His voice was low and slow, as though each word were being pulled from the depths of a hollow in his chest. A car accident. That was what the papers said. But I knew the truth the moment I saw his body on the cold metal table in the morgue. It was no accident." Claire softened her gaze and waited. "He was the only one who taught me how to read people, not through words but through eyes, gestures, and the spaces between them. He told me that if I wanted to survive in a world without rules, I would have to create my own. Vincent took a sip of whiskey, his fingers tightening around the glass until his knuckles turned white. After he died, my mother vanished. She did not die, but she ceased to exist, locked herself in her room, spoke to no one. Every meal became a duty. Every look passed through me instead of resting on me. I learned how to be silent, how to take care of everything myself, and then I met the first man I trusted after my father. Claire tilted her head as her eyes caught the fleeting tension at the corner of Vincent's mouth. His name was Matteo, my father's closest friend, or so I believed. After my father's death, Matteo took me in, taught me how to shoot, how to calculate, how to run an organization before I was even old enough to hold a driver's license. I respected him as a second father. Vincent's voice caught for a brief instant, and then he gave a quiet, humorless smile, until I discovered that he was the one who ordered my father's murder. Shock flickered across Claire's eyes, but she said nothing because she knew this was not the moment for words. I was 17 when I learned the truth. Matteo believed I was still an innocent boy. He lied so well that even when I confronted him, he could look straight into my eyes without blinking. But there was one thing my father once told me that I never forgot, that a liar always leaves behind one tiny detail they believe no one will ever notice. And he did. Vincent leaned forward, and for the first time his eyes left the empty space and locked onto Claire. I killed him 3 weeks later, one bullet directly into his forehead, in the very chair where my father used to sit and read the newspaper every morning. I felt nothing. No pain, no regret, no emptiness. Only silence. Claire felt her chest tighten, not with horror but with the sudden understanding that in that moment Vincent was no longer the powerful, threatening man she had known. He was only a betrayed child grown within a world where no one loved him enough to stay, and no one was loyal enough not to stab him in the back. "Since then I have never fully trusted anyone," he said softly, "and everyone who enters my life must prove they are not like him. No one ever has, except you." Claire felt a sharp ache in her heart. She did not know whether it was a warning or a confession, but she knew that from that moment on, she no longer stood outside this story. She had been chosen, either to redeem him or to drown with him in wounds that would never truly heal. That morning began with an unnatural silence. There was no soft music drifting from the hidden speakers, as on every other day. No servant arrived with Claire's coffee at the usual hour, and Marco, who always appeared the moment she stepped from her room, had suddenly vanished. Claire moved along the corridor with the sensation of walking across thin ice, each step making the air grow colder. As she neared the main staircase, she heard muted voices rising from below, mingled with the stern cadence of Vincent's tone. She knew she should not go on, yet her feet would not stop. When she reached the large doorway leading to the mansion's meeting room, the door stood ajar, a narrow slit of dim light spilling out, and Claire paused, half from curiosity, half from the instinct that she was about to witness something from which there would be no return. Inside, Vincent stood at the head of a long mahogany table, one hand resting lightly on the surface, his gaze freezing a man kneeling on the floor below. It was Angelo, one of Vincent's most loyal soldiers from the early days. Claire remembered how he once bowed to her in passing through the garden with a faint, polite smile always touching his face, but now his features were smeared with blood, his lips split open and his hands bound behind his back with plastic cord pulled so tight that blood seeped from his wrists. Marco stood to the side with his hands clasped behind him, his face expressionless. "Do you know what your mistake was?" Vincent asked in an even voice that needed no volume to paralyze the room. Angelo gasped and lifted his eyes. "I only took a small amount, just a little. I didn't think." "You didn't think," Vincent cut in as one foot nudged Angelo's ribcage hard enough to draw a groan. "You didn't think I would find out. You didn't think I would care if you sold my schedule to a rat already marked for death." Claire covered her mouth with one trembling hand and gripped the doorframe with the other. Angelo had betrayed Vincent, and if that was true, this was no warning, this was judgment. "Vincent," Angelo stammered, "I swear I only needed the money. My mother is sick. I had no other choice." Vincent circled behind him, his voice dropping low. "I paid your mother's hospital bills 3 times. You think I did not know? This was never about the money. This was about your choice to betray me." He drew the gun from Marco's waistband with a slowness that raised cold shivers along Claire's spine. She stood frozen because she had heard the rumors of Vincent Morelli and the whispered tales of purges without trace. But now she was witnessing the unvarnished truth with her own eyes. He was not the man who told stories on rainy nights in the library. He was not the sorrowful gaze when he spoke of his father. He was a predator, a king who did not tolerate betrayal. Vincent raised the gun and aimed at Angelo's head, In that instant, Claire saw his lips press tight, and his eyes remain utterly unshaken. "I beg you," Angelo sobbed like a child, but the gunshot echoed before any further words could be spoken. The dry, explosive sound slammed into Claire's chest like a brutal blow. Blood splattered across the carpet and onto Vincent's shoes. Angelo collapsed like an empty sack. Vincent said nothing as he handed the gun back to Marco and turned to leave the room. His eyes briefly caught Claire standing frozen at the doorway. They looked at each other without a word and without expression. Yet in that gaze, Claire understood he knew she had seen everything, and what terrified her most was that some part of her did not run, did not scream, only felt the dizzy certainty that she had taken one step into the darkness with no path back. Vincent had shown her his human face, and now he had shown her the beast, and Claire, though trembling, still could not stop herself from walking deeper into the storm. After Angelo's death, the air within the mansion seemed veiled beneath an invisible layer of cold mist. Claire barely slept that night, as the dry crack of the gunshot and the image of his body collapsing to the floor replayed relentlessly in her mind like a film with no pause button. She understood all too clearly that she had seen what she was never meant to see, and had stood far too close to a world that did not belong to her. The next morning, when fragile sunlight filtered through the curtains of her room, Claire made the decision to leave this place. She gathered her few personal belongings with trembling hands as she pulled the zipper closed, her heart pounding as if one delayed beat would steal the last of her courage. She opened her door and stepped into the corridor only to meet the unblinking gaze of two guards standing like stone statues. She tried to speak calmly and said she needed fresh air outside, but was met with a firm shake of the head. She returned to her room breathless and tried calling her former colleague at the hospital only to find the signal completely blocked, the screen showing nothing but a lost connection symbol. For the first time, she truly felt she was no longer a free person but an object preserved inside a luxurious glass cage. By afternoon, Marco appeared and politely invited her down to the sitting room where Vincent was already waiting with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his expression serene as if nothing had occurred the night before. Claire stood before him without sitting. "I want to leave," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, though the tremor betrayed her. Vincent studied her for several suffocating seconds before taking a sip of whiskey. "You cannot," he replied simply. "I am not your prisoner." Claire bit her lip as fear and anger surged together. "You are not a prisoner," Vincent answered slowly, "but you are mine, at least for now." Claire shook her head, her eyes reddening. "I have seen too much. I cannot live in a place where everything can end with a single bullet." Vincent set the glass down, rose to his feet and approached her step by step. With each step, the distance between them narrowed, and the air itself seemed to compress. "You are alive because I allow it," he said softly without raising his voice, yet each word fell like stone upon marble. "And you are safe only because I choose it to be so." Claire felt her throat grow raw. She knew it was not quite a threat, but a naked truth. Vincent tilted his head and his gaze softened in a way that was far more dangerous. "Beyond that gate are those who want me dead and would gladly crush anyone who stands near me. Do you really think you can simply step back into your old life? Do you think you are still anonymous?" His words pierced Claire's awareness like needles, as images of Angelo's final gaze and Marco's warning about the press and family and exposure rushed back to her. Vincent did not need chains to confine her, but fear planted precisely where she was weakest. "If you truly wish to leave," Vincent continued in a lower voice, "I can have someone escort you out of the city, but you will never return to the hospital, and you will never live under the name Claire Bennett again. You will have to disappear." Claire closed her eyes and saw her mother's face, the familiar streets leading to her small apartment, and the simple life she once thought mundane, now distant as an old dream. When she opened her eyes, Vincent was still there, waiting, neither forcing nor comforting her, only the calm patience of someone already holding the outcome. At last Claire sank into the chair as if all strength had drained from her body. She said nothing more, and Vincent allowed a faint, almost invisible smile to touch his lips, just enough for her to understand that in this confrontation, she had lost the moment she spoke. She was no longer guarded by guns or bars, but by fear, confusion, and an invisible bond she did not yet understand and could no longer sever. Claire later sat alone in the garden behind the mansion, where every flower bed was trimmed in perfect obedience to an absolute order. The breeze carried the gentle scent of jasmine and lavender. Yet she felt no peace as Vincent's words from the afternoon replayed in her mind without end. She knew she was no longer free, but what unsettled her more was the turmoil in her chest. The nameless emotion stirred each time their eyes met. Footsteps sounded upon the stone path, drawing her back to the present as Vincent approached, wearing no suit as usual, but only a white shirt with rolled sleeves and an open collar, revealing his collarbone and the faint line of a scar along his neck. He sat beside her in silence for a long while, as if sharing presence rather than conversation. Then, as if reading her thoughts, he said quietly that he knew she was still thinking about the day he awoke. Claire nodded faintly with her gaze fixed on the small fountain at the garden's center. "That was no coincidence," Vincent said in a voice as light as the breeze yet weighted with something unseen. "I heard everything from the moment you entered the room, every whisper each night, every sigh you believed fell into emptiness." She turned to him with wide eyes and a racing heart. "You were awake before you opened your eyes." Vincent nodded, his dark gaze deepening like still water. "I was poisoned, not a natural coma but a powerful neurotoxin that slowed my heart and left my body nearly motionless with only the most basic life sustained. Yet I could still hear and still feel trapped within my own cage." Claire lifted a hand to her mouth, unable to imagine the terror of being alive yet voiceless and powerless. "And then," Vincent said without taking his eyes from her face, "you kissed me." The space between them seemed to freeze as heat rushed to Claire's cheeks and she wanted to protest that it had not been a real kiss, only an impulsive moment of weakness. Yet the words choked in her throat. In that instant something changed. Vincent continued in a lowered voice. "It felt as though an electric current ran through my body. Nerves thought dead began to stir. My heart rate surged and I felt it, something strong enough and real enough to break through the toxic bond." Claire stared at him unblinking as if pulled into the revelation. "You think I was the reason you woke?" she whispered. Vincent did not answer at once and instead looked up at the sky, now darkening toward violet, before turning back and saying slowly that he did not think but knew. A soft breeze lifted Claire's hair, and she felt her eyes sting not from romance, but from something far deeper. The sensation of being needed not as a pawn on a chessboard, but as an irreplaceable piece. Vincent told her that in his world where everything was decided by loyalty and betrayal, the only thing no one could ever predict was emotion. Claire clasped her hands together to keep her voice steady and said she was only a nurse who did not belong to this world. Vincent tilted his head and his gaze for once held not coldness but a rare gentleness as he replied that he had never truly awakened in this world until she entered it. Claire met his eyes and knew that even as reason warned her this was a mistake, her heart had already left the place of safety and crossed the boundary from the moment her lips touched the man the world called a monster. Yet to her now he was a being newly risen from hell, having found one small thing real enough to hurt in its truth connection. The night rain fell softly against the tiled roof of the Morelli mansion, each drop tapping against the glass like a silent warning. Claire awoke in the middle of the night with a cold spreading through her chest, not from the weather but from something unseen that had drained all warmth from the room. She rose, slipped on a thin sweater and stepped into the corridor where the silence felt unnatural. Marco was nowhere to be seen, neither were the guards, and with every step her sense that something was wrong grew heavier. When she reached the steps leading to the garden, a rough hand suddenly clamped over her mouth from behind. Before she could cry out, something icy pressed against her throat and everything dissolved into darkness. When Claire regained consciousness, the rain was gone, and so was the gentle light of the mansion. She lay on damp ground with her hands bound behind her back, tape across her mouth and her head spinning. The stench of moldy wood and cigarette smoke filled her lungs. The room was dark save for a single sickly yellow bulb swaying from the ceiling. A man stood with his back to her, tall and lean with disheveled brown hair and a worn leather jacket. When he turned she recognized, the eyes though changed now colder and more feral. Dario Morelli, the adopted brother Vincent, had mentioned only once in a voice as dry as an unhealed scar. Dario studied her for a long while, then dragged a chair to sit before her and slowly peeled the tape from her mouth, apologizing mockingly for the lack of courtesy as he claimed he merely wished to speak with her. Claire struggled to remain calm, though her heart thundered violently as she demanded who he was and why he had taken her. Dario tilted his head with a crooked smile and said she truly did not know him, that he was the one who had grown up with Vincent, who once called him brother and family, until Vincent himself cast him out for daring to question a few small decisions. He circled her like a predator observing its prey, and revealed he had been watching her since the moment she kissed Vincent in the hospital. Asking if she understood how that instant had changed everything, Claire trembled and pleaded that she had nothing to do with their war and begged to be released. Dario laughed coldly and said she was everything to that war. The reason Vincent survived, the only weakness he had exposed and the tool he would exploit. His words tightened around her throat like claws as she asked what he intended to do. Dario sat again and said with chilling calm that he would give Vincent a choice, either to step into the light and die in blood as a king should, or to watch her die first slowly and painfully. Claire bit her lip until blood rose, never feeling so small, yet still clinging to the last fragments of her strength as she whispered that Vincent would never allow it. Dario leaned close, his breath rancid with old smoke and hatred, and said that was exactly what he wanted. Then he turned his back and left her bound in the darkness with fear blooming heavier in her chest. Claire shut her eyes, forcing herself to stay composed, knowing that if Vincent did not find her in time, this terror would not remain a memory, but become her true end. Yet deep within her, a fragile faith still flickered, that the man who had risen from death for a single kiss would not let her fall into darkness again. She remained curled in the corner of the room for hours, as time dragged on as if the outside world had frozen. She did not cry nor scream, but listened to every faint sound as if it were her last thread of connection to reality. Peeling gray brick walls, rotting ceiling, and the scuttle of rats behind the walls were all that surrounded her. Yet what chilled her most was not the darkness but the memory of Dario's eyes, calm, cold, and quietly dangerous. When he returned hours later carrying an old laptop, Claire thought he would resume threats or bargain with her life like a card on the table. But instead he sat and turned the screen toward her, showing security footage from the Morelli mansion on the day Vincent collapsed from the poison. Claire held her breath as Dario sneered, asking if she truly believed a single accidental kiss had shattered everything. She remained silent as the cold spread deeper in her chest. Dario said he knew far more than she guessed, that Vincent had already shown signs of recovery, that he had his own doctors preparing antidotes, yet chose not to use them because he waited to see who would betray him, who would reveal themselves when they believed he could not retaliate. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening, and said that when she entered and kissed Vincent, everything changed. Not because she broke the toxin, but because she became the perfect piece on the board. Claire felt hollowness spread through her as everything she trusted seemed to fracture. When she asked what he would do, her voice nearly vanished. Dario replied gently, as if discussing business, that he had implanted a device within her, a micro-tracker hidden beneath the skin, so small and silent that Vincent would think he had escaped, while in reality, every step he took with her would lead death right to his door. Claire shook as tears spilled uncontrollably and whispered that he was insane. Dario laughed softly and said she could not understand that Vincent had taken everything from him, family, honor, identity, turning him into a shadow, and now he finally had the chance to end it all, using her without Vincent ever seeing it coming. The air seemed to drain from the room as Claire looked into Dario's eyes and saw, not wild hatred, but a ruthless stillness of someone who had calculated too long and had nothing left to lose. When she asked why it had to be her, Dario answered without hesitation that she was the only person. Vincent could never kill the blind spot in his perfect system, and now that blind spot belonged to him. Claire trembled, not from fear of death but from realizing she had been turned into a weapon, a piece in a monstrous scheme she never imagined she would be dragged into. She felt dirty, betrayed, manipulated, yet in that same moment, a spark ignited in her mind, because if she was the one Dario believed beyond suspicion, then she could also become the one who would change the game. Claire wiped her tears, lifted her head, and stared directly at her captor, and within her eyes there was no longer only fear but will. Dario may have imprisoned her and turned her into bait, but he had not captured her heart, and that heart was no longer merely that of a fragile nurse. It had become the dangerous piece he himself had fatally underestimated. In the thick darkness of the eastern outskirts of the city, an old warehouse stood silent as if forgotten by the world, its brick walls cracked, its tin roof scarred with rust, and its yellowed bulbs flickering weakly like something on its last breath. Outside, the black SUV was parked several blocks away, with its engine long since cold. Vincent Morelli sat inside with eyes sharp as blades fixed on the blueprint of the warehouse in his hand. Marco in the driver's seat with a handgun resting on his thigh. No one spoke and no one needed to, because they both knew why they were there. A rescue was not something Vincent normally did. He was the one who gave orders, not the one who risked his own life. But this time the one being held was Claire, and that changed every rule in his mind. Vincent opened the car door and stepped out without a sound, black shirt tightly fitted to his body, 2 guns at his hips, his eyes darkened by a quiet, lethal intent. He signaled for Marco to circle to the rear, while he advanced straight toward the front entrance, where a lone guard stood with a cigarette glowing at his lips. Before the man could react, he collapsed from a precise strike to the neck, the sound of his falling body swallowed by the rain. Vincent slipped inside his boots, whispering over the old concrete floor like a hunting cat. He knew time was scarce because Dario would not keep Claire long once he sensed his plan was threatened. The first sound Vincent heard was metal clashing, then a ragged breath. He accelerated down the narrow corridor with his gun already drawn. Marco fired the first shot as 2 guards suddenly appeared from a side passage. Gunfire cracked violently, light flared and vanished. The stench of gunpowder filled the air. Vincent did not slow, shooting as he moved with every bullet finding its mark. The third guard barely raised an arm before a shot buried itself in his shoulder, and a clean kick sent him unconscious. Vincent reached the iron door at the end of the hall where faint light leaked through the gap. Without hesitation, he delivered a powerful kick that sent the door bursting open with a thunderous metallic roar. Claire lifted her head in stunned disbelief when she saw Vincent standing there. Rain-wet hair, disheveled face hard as steel, eyes fixed only on her. "Claire," Vincent called in a low, hoarse voice heavy with command. Before she could answer, a gunshot rang out behind him. As Dario emerged from the shadows with his weapon aimed straight at Vincent, his gaze blazing with hatred, Vincent rolled aside to evade the first shot and dragged Claire down in the same instant. Marco surged in from behind, bullets slicing through the air, striking wooden crates and sending splinters flying. Dario fired as he retreated, shouting with fury that Vincent could never take everything back, and that she would be the one to kill him because everything had already been prepared. Vincent said nothing as he shoved Claire aside out of the line of fire, and a single shot from his gun struck Dario's leg, sending him crashing to his knees, though he still struggled to clutch the weapon. In a sudden burst, Claire lunged forward and kicked the gun from his hand. Her breath ragged, her body trembling, yet her eyes no longer afraid as she cried out that she was not his tool. Vincent closed in with his gun aimed straight at Dario's head, but then slowly lowered it and looked directly into the eyes of the traitor, saying that death by his hand would be mercy, and that Dario would live to watch everything he had ever wanted burned to ash. Marco restrained Dario while Vincent turned and caught Claire as she collapsed into his arms. The scent of blood, smoke, and rain tangled in the air, yet nothing could drown out the thunder of the two hearts beating between them. No words were spoken. Only the gentle pressure of their hands confirmed they were alive, and that this time they had chosen together to face the darkness. The hidden cabin among the northern pine forests, far from the city, lay quietly beneath a slate-gray sky, as if guarding a secret the world could not touch. Claire opened the wooden door and helped Vincent inside, as the scent of pine and old wood smoke rushed out to meet them, carrying a strange warmth that nearly brought tears to her eyes. Blood stained Vincent's shirt, not much but enough to tighten her chest each time the red spread through the black fabric. He uttered no complaint of pain, only watched her in silence, his eyes deep as a winter lake, calm yet hiding waves only Claire could feel. She eased him onto the bench beside the fireplace and hurried to retrieve the medical kit hidden near the back. Her hands shook, yet she forced them steady as she cut away the bloodied fabric, exposing the long gash along his right side. The blood already clotted, though the wound was still swollen and red. Claire exhaled sharply, unable to hide her worry, and whispered that he should have stayed at the hospital. Vincent merely tilted his head and gave a faint, elusive smile, saying that if he had stayed she would no longer be there. The simple sentence made her hands still as she looked at him, her eyes uncertain emotions with nowhere left to hide. She wanted to scold him, to call everything madness, to say she had never expected her life to turn this way, and yet in that same moment she realized she no longer wished to leave this place, even if it was only a wooden cabin without phones, without signal, without soft beds or lavish meals, because here in this moment she felt closer to something real than she had in all her noisy years. She cleaned the wound, applied medication, and wrapped the bandage carefully, and each time her hands touched his skin, Vincent watched her as if trying to read every thought. "Claire," he murmured, his voice sinking somewhere deep in his chest. "I once thought I could no longer feel anything. After so many years. After every death I caused or witnessed, my heart had turned to stone without my knowing it. But you—" Claire lifted her gaze. The firelight mirrored in her eyes like two glass beads filled with emotion, and she interrupted him gently yet firmly, telling him not to speak unless he was certain, because she had already been hurt. "Enough." Vincent pressed his lips together, then nodded slowly, reaching for her hand, his large rough hands that had caused so many unforgivable things, now enclosing her smaller, trembling yet courageous one. As he said, he could not change the past, but if she gave him a chance, he would begin again from this moment, not as a Morelli, but as a man learning how to love. Claire did not answer at once. She lowered her head, her shoulders trembling, before suddenly lifting herself and leaning in to place a gentle kiss upon his cheek, not of gratitude nor pity, but a soft whisper of reborn trust. Outside, snow began to fall silently, each white flake settling upon the cabin roof, burying every old trace. And inside the small room, the two of them sat side by side before the fire, with no words between them, only a peaceful silence, appearing for the first time since everything began. And in that, a moment, Claire knew she had truly chosen to stay, not from fear, not from debt, but because her heart had quietly carved that man's name into rhythms she had never expected. The fire crackled softly, its pale orange light brushing over the scars on Vincent's body, as if trying to soften the sharp edges once bound to his name, while Claire sat opposite, wrapped in a thin blanket holding a warm cup of tea, her eyes fixed on the flames as her thoughts drifted far back in time. For a long while she said nothing, breathing quietly, her lips tightening now and then, as if struggling with herself, until at last she spoke in a low, steady voice, saying that when she was a child her father was her entire world, a tall man, whose hands always smelled of engine oil, and whose eyes smiled. Each time he called her his little princess. He worked in an old garage on the south side of Chicago, where the roar of engines and the scent of smoke were part of the air they lived in. And then he died not of age nor of accident, but from a stray bullet in a territorial war unrelated to him. The police called it an accident. The news called it chance. But Claire knew that whoever fired the gun that day, the hand behind it belonged to the same cold world Vincent once lived in. She told all of this without blame, without tears, as if she were gently removing fragments of memory from her heart and laying them between them as an unhealed wound. Vincent did not interrupt. He sat with his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on her as if every word were a sentence he was willing to accept. When she finished, silence fell again. The fire still burned, the wind brushed the window, yet between them hung a dense stillness in which Vincent could hear his own heart. Then it was his turn. He drew a deep breath as if pulling emotion up from the deepest place, and told of the night his father died, not in peace, but before his eyes. Blood spread across old tiles, his mother's scream shattering the world he was, 12 years old, and from that instant, compassion vanished. From his life he did not cry nor seek justice. He only learned to control pain and turn it into a tool to build an empire no one would ever touch again. He spoke of sleepless nights, of recurring nightmares, of the face in the mirror becoming the man who had killed his own childhood. He said he once believed power would fill all emptiness, but in the end it built only a gilded prison, where no one could reach his heart, and no one would stay unless he held them with fear. Claire listened in silence, her breath matching the rhythm of each memory. He unraveled slowly and painfully true, and when he stopped speaking, silence returned, this time not heavy but warm like a gentle touch upon a nameless ache. Claire rose, stepped closer, and sat beside him, placing her hand softly upon his. She did not speak forgiveness nor claim understanding, but in her eyes and in that quiet pressure, Vincent knew he was no longer alone in the dark, and in that the moment between them there were no captor and captive, no ruler, of shadows, and one pulled into the underworld, but two battered souls finding each other in fire, in loss, and in a nameless feeling growing with every shared heartbeat. That night, the small cabin in the heart of the forest was wrapped in a quiet so gentle it almost felt tender. The sky was crystalline. A dense carpet of stars stretched above the pine trees, and the wind whispered softly through the cracks in the door like the gentlest lullaby Claire had ever heard. She and Vincent sat side by side on the narrow bench by the window, 2 cups of hot cocoa resting on the table, pale steam drifting upward beneath the muted yellow light. For the first time after days of chaos, Claire felt her heart loosen, no longer bound by fear, judgment, or the fragile line between right and wrong. Vincent placed a hand on her shoulder, not gripping tightly but with enough pressure for her to feel the steady truth of his presence. She leaned her head against him, eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips, wishing aloud that everything could remain like this forever, her words dissolving into the night. Vincent did not answer immediately. He gazed outward where darkness and snow merged, where peace was as fragile as the thin frost on glass, and whispered that they were standing in the eye of the storm, quiet but not the end. Claire lifted her eyes to his, and in that look was understanding that needed no explanation because she had always known. The ghosts of the past, the enemies still breathing, the secrets still buried, were all waiting for the moment to devour this brief peace. Yet she was no longer afraid. Not while beside the man whose darkness and light she had both witnessed. They prepared a simple meal from canned food, sharing each piece of bread as if dining in a fine restaurant, laughing and trading small fragments of their past that neither had ever dared to tell. Claire spoke of the day she skipped school as a child just to catch fireflies, Vincent of the first plate of spaghetti he ever cooked for his sister after their mother died. In the quiet afternoons, he also placed his gun in her hand, teaching her how to aim, how to hold her breath, telling her that in his world, peace must sometimes be protected with iron. Those trivial memories bound them not as nurse and kingpin, but as 2 ordinary people learning how to live again, one breath at a time. As the night deepened, Claire rested against him on the bench, a blanket wrapped around them, their breathing blending in the stillness. Her eyes slowly closed as his fingers intertwined with hers. Yet the peace Vincent had warned of did not last. At 3 in the morning, the distant growl of engines cut through the silence of the forest. Faint, yet unmistakable, Vincent opened his eyes at once, his body tensing like a wild animal catching the scent of danger. Claire did not wake until his hand tightened around hers and he murmured that someone was coming. She sat up instantly in the darkness. They needed no more words as they rose together and hurried to the window. Headlights flared between the trees. 1 vehicle, then 2, then 3. No license plates, no signal of friend or ally. Vincent seized the pistol hidden in the kitchen cabinet, the familiar lethal clarity returning to his gaze, and told her to grab her coat and stay with him, in a voice that allowed no hesitation. Claire did not question him, her heart racing but her mind steady as she understood that the peaceful night was over and the darkness had finally found them. Vincent led Claire from the cabin before dawn, breaking across snow-covered trails, headlights slicing through thick fog like cold blades. They spoke little, exchanging only glances and brief gestures that said everything had changed. When they reached one of the safe houses buried in the quiet outskirts, Vincent immediately activated his secure communication system and called Luca, his most loyal right hand. And within minutes, urgent rings echoed through the house like an emergency siren, as Luca's face appeared on the screen, grim and unembellished. Stating without preamble that Daria was still alive and was gathering men, Vincent stood motionless for a moment, his hands gripping the chair, his gaze lowering like a sky before a storm, asking who in a voice tempered like forged steel. Luca hesitated, then exhaled hard, and said Ricardo and Arturo from the eastern docks, and that there were rumors of an alliance. Claire sat in the corner clutching the fabric of her coat, forcing herself to remain calm as her heart pounded like a war drum, because she knew those names. The bloodless phantoms of the underworld whispered by the press. Vincent nodded slowly, turned, and entered the small study where a city map lay spread across the desk marked with transport routes, warehouses, docks, red symbols and lines drawn long ago. As if he had always known this day would return, he summoned every remaining loyal man with phone calls that carried only cold command, without hesitation or negotiation. Claire stood at the threshold watching him from behind, and beneath the yellow desk lamp, Vincent was no longer the man who had held her in the cabin the night before, but the Dark King calling his forces back to war. Yet what unsettled her was not that change but the feeling inside herself, because instead of fear, her heart raced with something else entirely, a bond she could not deny. Luca arrived only hours later with several trusted men, and the house became a temporary command center for the rebuilding of power. Maps expanded, computers remained lit without pause, intelligence on enemy movements updated constantly. Claire moved among them unrestrained, yet every gaze carried the same unspoken truth, that she was the only unarmed person in the room, and the only one who held a strange power over Vincent. Night fell once more, and at last Vincent sat beside her, his eyes weary yet burning with that frightening clarity, confessing that he had once wanted to escape everything but now understood that to find peace sometimes one must end the war with one's own hands. Claire did not answer with words, only reached for his hand and held it tightly, and in her eyes there was no plea for him to stop and no prayer for safety, only understanding and an unspoken promise that whatever came she would remain. Tomorrow Vincent would return to the old battlefield where darkness awaited him, but this time he would not walk into it alone, and this time he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The dawn had not yet fully arrived, but a pale violet light had begun to stain the misted window panes as Claire sat alone in the small room at the end of the corridor, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold, while the sound of armed men pacing outside, the clatter of metal, the rustle of maps being unfolded formed a tense soundtrack to a play she was no longer sure she wished to keep acting in. Vincent was downstairs with Luca and the inner circle preparing for the largest counterattack since his awakening, and Claire knew that once he walked back out through that door, there would be no turning back for him or for her. Part of her longed to run, to escape this world of guns and blood and lies. She had once been a nurse who believed in saving lives and had never imagined she would love a man like Vincent Morelli, yet the stronger part of her, born from something deeper and more unyielding, could not deny what she had seen of the man beneath the armor, the cracks hidden beneath the cold exterior, the blood-stained memories saturated with pain, and the love he held for her spoken without words yet clearer than anything else in her life. When Vincent entered the room, his gaze went straight to her because he did not need to ask to know that she was struggling. He sat beside her in silence for a long while, the air between them taut as a drawn string waiting to snap, and at last it was Claire who broke it by asking whether he could stop, her voice trembling yet steady. Vincent looked at her long and deeply before shaking his head and saying that if he stopped, the others would not, and they would come for her and kill everyone he loved, and that he could not let that happen ever again. The truth of his words cut through her chest. Not with cruelty, but with inevitability. Claire rose and went to the window where several men were checking weapons in the dim light, and drew a slow, deep breath before asking what he wanted her to do. Vincent stepped beside her and told her he wanted her to leave before everything began. That a car, a plane ticket, a false passport, and money had all been prepared, so she could disappear and begin again somewhere without blood and without him. Claire turned to him and asked what would happen to him, and for the first time she saw naked vulnerability in the eyes of the man who once made a city tremble, as he said he would not return, and could not be sure he would survive, but would rather die than let her be pulled deeper into that life. And in that instant she knew her choice as she stepped forward and took his hand and told him she was not staying because he needed her, but because she could not live without him. Vincent said nothing and only pulled her into his chest as both of them stood there between an unfinished mourning and an approaching war and a love born where no one could have imagined, and Claire chose to stay even if that meant walking into hell with him. The wail of sirens tore through the night, like the herald of a nightmare as the once silent estate erupted with rushing footsteps, shouted orders and emergency lights flashing across the ceilings. Claire stood in the long corridor with her heart pounding so hard she could scarcely feel it, as Vincent had departed 15 minutes earlier with the first unit, and the last look he gave her carried torment, protection, and an unspoken promise. Luca remained with her in a small security detail, but Claire no longer wished to wait as she pulled on the bulletproof vest he handed her, her hands trembling while her voice left no room for argument when she said she was going with him. Luca tried to stop her, but the resolve in her eyes forced him to nod. The armored vehicle tore into the night toward the abandoned warehouses in the eastern part of the city where intelligence placed Dario and his allied forces. Along the way, Claire clenched the small pistol Luca had given her, and the cold weight of it in her palm made one terrifying truth unavoidable. She was entering a real battlefield, no longer the shadowed game she had once watched from the edge. When they arrived, gunfire already exploded like New Year fireworks as Claire moved low behind Luca through rusted containers and fractured darkness. And when they reached the rear of the warehouse, Vincent was already there with blood running along his temple, yet his eyes still sharp and his voice still command itself. He looked at Claire with a flash of shock that turned instantly to vigilance, and told her she should not be there. But she answered, without blinking, that there was nowhere else she could be. Before he could speak again, a volley of bullets tore across the space, forcing everyone down, and the true battle began. Luca kept Claire in the rear at first, but not for long, as an enemy gunman slipped through the western perimeter and appeared behind Vincent. Claire saw the muzzle flare and did not think as she lunged forward, shoved Vincent aside and pulled the trigger. The shot thundered beside her ear and the enemy collapsed like a felled tree. Vincent turned, and for the first time his eyes held both astonishment and unhidden trust. No words were needed as they fought back to back amid tearing gunfire and shouted commands. Claire fired with steady precision as if every dormant instinct had awakened during the days beside him, and she was no longer the lost nurse in this world but his equal in it, and she knew it. The battle dragged on for more than 2 hours with the air thick with gunpowder, blood, and iron dust. The enemy finally withdrew after Vincent struck Dario in the shoulder, forcing him to crawl back to his vehicle like a wounded beast. Claire dropped to her knees beside a man gravely wounded and pressed her own coat to his bleeding while searching for Vincent through the smoke. As the chaos faded and dawn finally broke, she stood atop the warehouse roof with the wind whipping her hair and her clothes stained with blood that might not even be hers. Vincent came to stand beside her, still holding his gun, but his eyes no longer those of a warrior, rather of a man who had realized the woman at his side was not merely his weakness, but his strength. They did not embrace or kiss nor need any outward sign of affection, as they stood together knowing that from that moment forward they had entered the darkest place side by side and walked out together. Claire was no longer an outsider, and she never would be again. 3 days after the final battle, the sky over New York was washed in a mournful gray, as though the entire city were in mourning for those who had fallen. Claire sat by the window of the large room in the Morelli mansion, her eyes following the seagulls circling the somber sky. She no longer felt shock or fear, only a strange, all-encompassing quiet seeping into every hidden corner of her soul. Vincent entered the room wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his frame visibly thinner, yet his eyes brighter and lighter than they had ever been when she first saw him in the hospital room. He sat beside her with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and spoke softly that he had signed the papers that morning. Claire turned to him and tilted her head to ask what papers. He replied that he had transferred full control to Luca and was withdrawing completely, not just in name but in reality. Claire fell silent for a few seconds, absorbing each word. He said it as if it were merely a business decision, but she knew that for Vincent it meant surrendering an entire lifetime. a world that had raised him, shaped him into the man he had become, and nearly cost him his life, her life, and himself. She asked quietly whether he was certain. Vincent nodded, his eyes following the last seagull disappearing beyond the rooftops, saying he had lived nearly 40 years in the dark, believing he had no choice, until she came and kissed him when he could not respond, when no one believed he would live, telling her that it was not merely a kiss but life itself, and that he wanted to live. Claire lifted her hand and gently touched his cheek, her fingers brushing the fresh scar near his temple where the bullet had nearly taken everything. She asked if Luca would do well. Vincent smiled faintly with a rare smile untainted by blood or power, and said Luca would be better than him. Unburdened by hatred, not dragged backward by the past, and most importantly, he did not have her. Claire laughed softly and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time without needing to speak. News of Vincent Morelli's withdrawal spread like wildfire. Former rival factions began laying down their hostility and sitting at negotiation tables. Luca assumed control smoothly through the wisdom learned from Vincent and his own restraint. There was no more bloodshed and no resistance, as if even the underworld itself understood that an era had ended. Claire and Vincent left the mansion 3 days later, carrying little with them, only a single suitcase, a few books, and one photograph of Claire in her nurse's uniform sitting beside the hospital bed, smiling faintly while Vincent was still in a coma. They drove across state lines without maps or schedules, stopping in small towns, eating at roadside diners, sleeping in motels with awkward names. No one recognized Vincent Morelli, and no one knew that the man whose gaze had once killed without blinking was now wiping his wife's hands after dinner. Claire never asked whether he would return, and Vincent never said. But in every handhold, every embrace, every shared sleep, while rain fell outside, they both knew they had chosen this road, imperfect but their own. Vincent had abandoned the throne of a blood-built empire not for redemption, but because for the first time in his life he knew he was allowed to choose, and he chose love. On one autumn morning, sunlight streamed through thin white curtains, bathing the small kitchen in a warm golden glow like memory itself. Claire stood at the sink, peeling apples, and occasionally glanced at Vincent, struggling to open a jar of jam with his right hand still aching slightly. He groaned softly, and Claire laughed as she stepped over, took the glass jar and twisted it open with one smooth motion. Teasing that the underworld trembled before Vincent Morelli, yet a jam jar could still defeat him, he smiled in the way only Claire ever saw, a mixture of gratitude and gentle embarrassment. This was their life now. Slow mornings, soft music from an old radio, shared breakfasts and shared books. No more gunfire, no more blood, yet the darkness never vanished entirely. It merely stepped back to the edge of sight, like a stranger watching from afar. Vincent remained vigilant, never sitting with his back to a door, and Claire understood that a past like his could not be erased by a single decision. But they learned to live with it as one lives with a scar, neither forgotten nor allowed to rule. Once at a small-town flea market, a boy slipped and fell, and Vincent was the first to rush over, lifting the child, brushing dust from his knees and gently asking if he was hurt. The mother looked at him with gratitude, never knowing that the man who once terrified the criminal world was kneeling before her son as nothing more than a kind man. After leaving the market, Claire quietly took Vincent's hand, needing no words because he understood that every small kindness he gave was a way of healing himself, not through grand gestures but through a heart that truly wished to change. Life is like that. There is always darkness, but there is always light as well. And sometimes all we need is one person who does not leave when we lose our way. One person who places a kiss upon our forehead when everything collapses. One person willing to sit beside us in silence simply to remind us we are no longer alone. The story of Claire and Vincent is not merely a tale of love between a nurse and a mafia boss. It is a story of redemption, of the courage to release power, and of the longing to live a life that truly belongs to oneself. Do you feel that way too? Have you ever met someone who made you want to become a better version of yourself? Please share your feelings below in the comments, as we would truly love to hear what lives in your heart. And if this story moved you and gave you something worth reflecting upon, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so that more meaningful and humane stories may reach our community each day. And do not forget to turn on notifications so you will not miss our upcoming videos. We sincerely thank you for spending your time with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next videos, with journeys full of emotion and humanity. We wish you and your family abundant health, a peaceful and warm life, and a heart always filled with love. Goodbye and see you again.